Hi, this is Tennille Jancola, and this is my case study, A Good Teacher Turns Bad for EDL 851. What do we know about this situation? Well, one of the things that we know is that this situation took place at Crestview Elementary. It is located in a rural area. It is one of 3 elementary schools that's faculty is comprised of 18 teachers, 2 special education teachers, and 3 aides. Mrs. Wilson is the principal of this school. She's in her 3rd year of being the principal, and at the time that she took over the principalship, the school was in very good shape. Attendance was very good, test scores were above average, and overall parents were highly pleased with the school. We also know that Mrs. Horton is a 1st grade teacher. She is a seasoned professional, a former teacher of the year. However, within Mrs. Wilson's 2nd year of being principal, towards the end, Mrs. Horton has become very stressed. She's less friendly. She's argumentative with her colleagues. She's upset when anyone disagrees with her. And Mrs. Wilson finds out that Mrs. Horton's husband has moved out, and she is now a single mom of two teenage boys. We also know that within 6 weeks of the beginning of this school year that the issue occurred, Mrs. Wilson began receiving phone calls and letters about Mrs. Horton. It was reported that Mrs. Horton was verbally abusive to her students. She screamed at them. She was irrational with them. She was late to school several times a week, and she was refusing to hold parent-teacher conferences. Mrs. Wilson did do her best to let the parents know that her observations of Mrs. Horton were not matching what they were telling her, that she tried to affirm them, but this did not settle the parents. Eventually, Mrs. Wilson receives a phone call from the superintendent telling her that 4 parents out of Mrs. Horton's class has contacted a school board member wanting their child immediately removed from Mrs. Horton's classroom, and Mrs. Wilson tells the superintendent she will investigate the situation even further. We also know that Mr. Stafford, he is a father of one of the girls in Mrs. Horton's class, has insisted on seeing Mrs. Wilson. He demands that his daughter be removed immediately from her class. He says that Mrs. Horton has refused a parent-teacher conference. She has ignored phone calls and notes from both he and his wife. And he reports that his daughter has a lot of anxiety. She cries every morning. She doesn't want to go to school. She isn't sleeping, and it has even began to interrupt her eating habits. Mrs. Wilson decides to go ahead and set up a conference with herself, Mr. Stafford, and Mrs. Horton. When they go into the meeting, Mr. Stafford is already irritated because Mrs. Horton does not seem to be prepared on questions that he's asking her. She has to look for records and proof of things dealing with his daughter. Mr. Stafford claims that Mrs. Horton is verbally abusing the kids. She's yelling at them. She's upsetting them daily. Mrs. Horton immediately lashes back at him, calling him a liar, telling him that everything he says is lies. So Mrs. Wilson immediately ends the conference, tells Mr. Stafford she will get back in touch with him, and turns to address Mrs. Horton. What do we need to know? Well, first of all, we need to know what is the sole root of Mrs. Horton's demeanor change. Why has the shift been so drastic? Yes, her husband has moved out, but why has he moved out? What is really, throwing Mrs. Horton for more of a loop? Some things I wonder about is she sick? Is her husband sick? Is there another woman involved? Has she started drinking? All of these things. What is Mrs. Horton's classroom environment really like? How many students are in the classroom? What are the dynamics of this classroom? How is Mrs. Horton toward her colleagues prior to this school year? Was she seen as somebody who could be trusted? Did they go to her? Was she someone they got along with? Why is Mrs. Wilson's perspective of Mrs. Horton's classroom so different from the parents' perspective and what's being reported to her? Is Mrs. Wilson not going in frequently enough? How many times has she visited the classroom? Why is the perspective so different? And how has Mrs. Horton been viewed in the past by parents? Yes, I understand she's a former teacher of the year. I understand that she's a seasoned professional, but have there been issues in the past with parents concerning Mrs. Horton? What do her students say about her? Are they the ones going home telling their parents about the situation? Is this something that they are communicating? What are her students really saying? And are the majority of the parents of the students in the class feeling the same way, or is it just these 4 families? Have more parents come forth and contacted Mrs. Wilson, or is it just these 4? And have these parents been parents that have been maybe issues or problems before to the school district? Those are some things I believe we need to know. My plan of action would first and foremost review Mrs. Horton's past evaluations. Has there ever been something in an evaluation that talks about her relationship or her professionalism with colleagues and with parents? I would definitely conference with Mrs. Horton immediately after the first phone call and after the first letter. I would definitely get with her. I would also immediately conference with her after I found out what happened with her husband. I would let her know that as the principal, I would be behind her. I would provide assistance or time off if she needed it, give her, get her a long-term sub, help her in any way deal with her emotional state. I would also begin to observe Mrs. Horton in the classroom frequently, more regularly than what I'm already doing. I would do more frequent walkthroughs. I would just pop in. I would listen outside the door and see if I'm hearing what's being reported to me, those types of things. Depending upon the negotiated agreement, I would also, and the evidence and data gathered, I would also begin to formulate a plan that I would believe Mrs. Horton would need to be put on if this situation continued and the reports and after I met with her did not resolve what was going on. I would definitely get her on a plan. I would make sure to document all incidences, phone calls, letters, talks with Mrs. Horton, talks with colleagues, talks with her partner teacher. I would definitely start to document everything as I have been. I would meet with the parents that called the school board members. I want to get their input. I want to know exactly what are they seeing, what is going on in the classroom, and what I need to gain insight about what I need to do. I would definitely compare my observations to that of what's being reported to me. I would go through that with a fine-tooth comb. I would wonder try to figure out why my perspective is so different and so drastic from what they are telling me. I would then collaborate with all stakeholders involved to gain insight to develop a plan with Mrs. Horton, with her partner teacher, if there is one, with parents, with the superintendent, and I would follow up with Mrs. Horton to discuss the plan in depth. On resolving the issues based on promoting the success of all students, I would first and foremost ensure a safe environment for all my students and staff. I have a teacher whose demeanor has changed drastically. There is something definitely going on. She is accused of lashing out at not only her students, but her colleagues irrationally. So I need to make sure that the environment of my entire building is safe and secure, not only physically, but mentally. I would definitely need to start getting a handle on that. I also have helped Mrs. Horton to deal with her emotional stress, provide resources for her, let her know that the school is behind her, give her the support that she needs, allow for time off if needed, and definitely get on a plan with her that everybody is happy with, that everyone can work with. And I would provide a set time to meet with Mrs. Horton regularly to discuss the situation at hand. I would make sure that we were in constant communication between the two of us, going over everything that is being said and reported. In debriefing the problem, things I was thinking about was Mrs. Horton has had something very traumatic take place, really something that goes far beyond her husband leaving and moving out. There is a root cause to that whole situation happening. I'm also thinking that Mrs. Horton is not emotionally stable or able to teach. She probably at this time does not need to be around young children until she can get everything worked out for herself. I'm also thinking Mrs. Wilson has to get on top of this situation immediately. There can be no time going by. This situation has to be dealt with. And I'm also thinking that the parents are very angry, they are very hurt, they are very lost, and they are very unsure of what to do or where to go. I'm also feeling compassion for Mrs. Horton. She has had a whole life turned upside down on her, and I'm feeling very compassionate about that. I'm also feeling compassion for Mrs. Wilson. She is a new principal. Things have been going really well, and now not only does she have an issue, she has a huge issue to deal with. I'm also concerned for Mrs. Horton's students. They are very young. They are first graders, 6 to 7 years old, and they are dealing with something that, they have the adult in their life is someone that they now are kind of probably scared of and are unsure of. I'm also concerned for the relationships between Mrs. Horton and her colleagues. Those relationships are vital to teachers when teaching, and to have those relationships damaged is not a good thing for the school. And I'm feeling a lot of empathy for the parents. They are hurt, they are angry, they are not sure what to do. And I, as a mom and as a teacher, I can relate on so many different levels. I'm also valuing at this time Mrs. Wilson's insight that this needed to be resolved quickly. She did go and start she did go and, get on top of the situation. She did visit with Mrs. Horton, but just to know that, but she knew it needed to be handled. I'm also valuing Mrs. Wilson's concern for Mrs. Horton. She's not just throwing her out to the wolves. She is concerned about her well-being. And I'm also valuing the parents for advocating for their children. They just didn't sweep it under the rug and say, oh, she's just having a bad day. Oh, things at home for her aren't really good right now. We have to be more understanding. They are advocating for their child, and I value that. And I also value the students who have to endure this on a daily basis. They are 6 to 7 years old, and the adult who they need to respect and look up to is someone who is scaring them and possibly damaging them. So I'm valuing them and their ability to walk into that classroom, even as hard as it is, on a daily basis. Unresolved issues, I feel like Mrs. Horton's emotional state. Has she dealt with what has happened? Is the school helping her deal with that? Are they getting on top of that? Mrs. Horton's relationships with her colleagues, will they be salvaged? Will the trust that was once there remain? Will it be able to return? Will she be able to resolve those relationships or keep them? Mrs. Horton's classroom environment, will she be able to follow the plan that is set in place? Will she be cooperative? Will she be able to get herself emotionally stable so she can deal with young kids and be able to be the teacher that she once was? And the issue of parents wanting their child out of Mrs. Horton's classroom. Will the plan that's set in place help resolve their distrust in Mrs. Horton so we don't have to disrupt the whole, both classrooms being involved? And are they being regularly communicated with? Are they being kept up to date about what is going on and how the situation is being handled? In promoting the academic success and personal well-being of every student, I feel that I have done this by ensuring that my staff and students were in a safe environment. I visited every classroom regularly. I met more often with Mrs. Horton's colleagues and partner teacher. I kept on top of everything that was going on in my building, making sure that what was going on in this one classroom was not disrupting the academic success of my building. I ensured that Mrs. Horton's students were safe. I visited Mrs. Horton's classroom frequently. I popped in, I visited with her students. I stepped outside, I listened, I made sure I was on top of that classroom. I developed a plan for Mrs. Horton to follow based on observations and what was followed in the negotiated agreement as well. I communicated with Mrs. Horton on how the situation was going to be handled, and I also gave her time to share with me what was really going on, giving her the opportunity so that we could help her. I communicated regularly with parents. I made sure they were feeling heard. I made sure that they were feeling valued, and I made sure that there was something in place to try to rebuild their trust, not only in the teacher, but in the district as well. I made sure that Mrs. Horton was receiving the help she needed. I allowed for time off. I provided a substitute if needed, and I stayed in constant communication with her on her current situation. And I set up times to meet with Mrs. Horton on a regular basis. I made sure that communication was taking place between myself, that teacher, those students, and those parents frequently, making sure that everybody was on the same page. Thank you for watching my presentation on the case study, A Good Teacher Turns Bad.